So there's a lot here and it's crazy complicated. I'm going to focus primarily on legal immigration because trying to unpack the what's happening from a illegal immigration and for decades is really not a useful conversation for this. For today, we're really going to deal with economic issues because of what I would deem as our poor immigration policy. And that's been a poor immigration policy for, you'll see some of the charts, through the last two administrations for sure. But it might be COVID related, could drive some of that, but for sure the last two administrations, but I would argue that this has been going on for even longer than that. Okay, so if I'm talking about immigration, why am I starting with a chart of the US? Well, this chart actually shows basically the number of households that grew, the dark green shows the number of households that grew by double digits, and it represents 15 states. But this basically just shows the population growth in certain states. And just looking at the data from the 2010 census up to the 2020 census. And the reason why I'm showing this is we have 15 states that grew by double digit. And for the most part, if we look at the economies of these states, they are growing faster and healthier with job creations and companies moving there than a lot of other states. And we can honestly, mathematically prove some of this data that one of the hardest hit states over the last 10 years has been Illinois. And if you look at this, chart here, it's only grown by 3%. And if you look at two states that have been growing robustly, have been Texas and Florida, and you can see how much they've been growing by, and even some of the bordering California, like Nevada and Arizona. And the reason why I'm showing you this is we know how important it is to grow a population in a city or a state, because when you have growth or new households being formed, more people come into your state. What happens? Well, number one, when people come there, usually they need a place to live. So that fuels the housing market. And then if you just think about the economic impact of fueling a growing housing market, the building side of it, the financing side of it, and then all the local retail and shopping that pops up because there's more people there that are living and spending. And then you get into just the job creation that happens from more people moving. So when you have net immigration into states, it makes these states a lot stronger. And so you can basically just apply this to the United States of America, is that we have been a really healthy country for the better part, for our entire existence, because we've been just continually having net immigration, which means more people continue to come here. We don't have people leaving. And so that's why I wanted to show this chart, is that it's really the easy data that shows how important it is to individual states, and their growth is just the simple fact of having more people there has such a domino effect in a positive way. And a lot of the states that are struggling are the ones that aren't growing, because their revenue base is getting older and dying, and they're not bringing in new. So just wanted to share that with you from a perspective, because I think it was an easy one to kind of illustrate. So if we start with the premise of net immigration is really important, then we start digging into some of the data points that I want to get into. So then we get into some of the economics. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth with some of the immigration stats and also the economics. And so when we look at, there's two charts here, really easy to explain. We're going to start with the one on the left. So what this shows is growth in working age population, and it shows percentage increase of the population. So we're going to look at percentage increase. So if you look at through the 80s, the 90s, and 2000s, pretty consistent. We had an increase of population of native born. We had an increase in population of immigrants. Now, if you look what happened since 2010, that number kind of fell off the cliff. 2010 to 2019, immigration only grew by 0.2%, or I should say working age population of immigrants only grew by 0.2, and native born also fell off the cliff down to 0.3. And the scary thing is, looking at the forecast on a go forward basis, is that we're not going to have growth of population. And I'll prove my point kind of walking through this dynamic, but that's one of the big demographic challenges that the US has right now. The great thing is it's actually easy to fix, but we have to change our policies. So if you look at those stats again, growth of working age population. Now on the right-hand side, it shows, basically like growth in GDP. So GDP is gross domestic product. It measures the growth of our economy. We want GDP to grow. because that means that we're creating more economic activity, more jobs, more wealth. And if you look back, this data, if you can see at the very bottom, it has a period of time from 52 to 61, 62 for that decade, this decade of 72, and then 82, 92, 2002, and 2012. And if you notice, we had GDP, real GDP growth through the 5 previous periods were all growing faster than 3%. And then over the last 20 years, we've been in the 1.9 to 2%. And a big part of that is if you look at the blue, the bright blue on there is growth of workers. Growth of workers shrunk down in the decade from 2002 to 2011 down to 0.3%. And the growth in workers did improve this last decade up to 1%, but still far below some of the historical data that we've seen. The black represents growth in real output, which really is measuring measuring productivity. So these are kind of the troubling signs when we look at long-term drivers, meaning things that are fundamentally built in the economy and will drive it. We're seeing these data points are going in the right direction. So the question is, how do we fix them? Well, the reality is we have a challenge. Now, this chart goes back to 1800. So it's pretty remarkable kind of pulling up some of this data. This looks at the fertility rate in America. So in 1800, fertility rate means the average family had 7 kids, right? And then you can see how that plummeted all the way through the 1940s, where that dropped down to 2. And then we had the post World War II boom, the baby boom, which got basically the average child per household up above 3 children per family. And so then you can see what we've now started to dip back down into starting in about 1980 going forward. So as of today, and honestly for the last 2 decades, our fertility rate has been below 2, which basically means we are not reproducing to replace ourselves, right? Because if you have mom and dad and they don't have 2 kids, they have 1.7, that means our society goes into decline. And so that's number one big issue that we're having in America, and a lot of other developed countries, Japan, many countries in Europe are dealing with the same issues, is that fertility rates are too low. So we're not keeping pace with our own growth. So guess what? What do we need to have happen? We have to have a strong immigration policy to continue to have those, to continue to have growth in workers and growth in our population. So then we look at, this is a stat that says foreign-born immigration. So there's a lot of data on here. It shows refugees, asylum seekers, students, work visas, immigrant visas. What this shows you is we had a nice increase from, back in 2010, we had about 1 million immigrants, and it peaked out in about 2016-17 at about 1.5, 1.6, and it's been on a steady decline. Now, the fall off over the last 2 years, 2020, 2021, we know that was COVID related, right? There's no way around that. We've seen this fall off. But obviously, if we are a nation that's going to be reliant on a growing economy, we need more workers and more population to be able to fulfill the growing needs of a society. And the fact that our immigration policy is going the other way is a massive challenge, which I believe needs to be resolved. Now, as you guys have probably garnered by now, I'm a big fan of Elon Musk. I kind of like him because he's just bold and says what's on his mind, but he also does it in a nice way. So this was a quote from a podcast that I listened to. It says, "Anybody that wants to work hard and do useful things we want in the United States." And it's not just people who are intellectually strong, but it's just anyone with a strong work ethic. Broadly, it's anyone who wants to work their ass off and contribute more than they take to the economy. So that's just necessarily going to make for a strong, better society in America. So it is that idea of we want the best and brightest. Now, Elon Musk in his podcast kind of went through this analogy that talked about, like, if you're a sports team, like, you want to get the best people on your team, right? So he was really equating this story to the United States being a place that everybody wants to come in. So why aren't we letting in the best and the brightest from all over the world? If they want to come here and be productive and be part of the growth in America, why aren't we letting a lot more people in? Because frankly, that's going to be what's going to solve some of these demographic changes that we have. And I think it's going to be critical on a go forward basis. So again, really like that quote. And then this just kind of supports some of this data. Now, this chart goes back to 1860. I don't think we need to illustrate back that far, but it really just shows you that, in 2010, in the 2010s, this was the slowest household growth on record. So you can see where we are now, household growth at 9%, population growth at 7%. So household growth basically is household formation, meaning people living together. Generally, it means a family getting started. And so this household growth, population growth needs to reverse trends to keep pace. And if you look back at some of the boom periods we've seen in our society, just even the last two big booms that we saw was post World War II America, and you can see population growth took off. That was really good for our economy. And then we saw the 80s and 90s, we saw population growth also improve. So these are things that we know have to happen as part of the immigration reform. So when you look at this data, so this shows basically household formation. So we peaked out in household formation in 2000. We've been on a pretty steady decline. We had periods like economic downturns like 2008, 2009, where we did not have much in the way of household formation. And you can see we've been on an uptrend. But unfortunately, what we're looking at is household formation of being under 1.5 million per year. And based on a lot of the data, this appears that these numbers should be double that household formations need to be at 2 to 2.5 million to really kind of change some of these demographic issues that we're dealing with. So let me come back to this one. So it looks to me like our immigration policy, instead of being at roughly 1 million new immigrants every year, that number needs to likely get to 2 to 2.5. And again, getting back to the housing market conversation, this chart actually kind of shows this idea of household formations versus housing starts. So let me walk through this. So a lot of people are, you heard me talk, I did a webinar on, about going into a recession, and most people are concerned, well, how is this going to impact the housing market? While I'll likely get into this in the next webinar, I think it's going to have less of a profound impact on the current housing market because of this chart. And so on the far right, you can see that we have many new households that have been formed, and that housing starts has not kept pace. So there's a disconnect right now where we've had some new households being formed. Some of this due to COVID. We might see some of this data because of COVID, more people living together just out of necessity. But we have seen some new households improving in this data. And if you look at the big disconnect, look at the housing start data going back to like 2005. So you can see housing starts were far greater than household formation, which led to the financial crisis, in my opinion, because they were overbuilding homes. People were getting over leveraged in their house, and there wasn't enough new households to support that. And then you saw, obviously, that come crashing down, which is what this chart is showing. So kind of getting back to this whole idea of we need to have an immigration policy that's really promoting getting the best and brightest from all around the world, and those with with an amazing work ethic that want to come produce. And that's what's going to really help our country thrive. And we have to get serious about it. It has to be part of the policy. And we've all read articles and seen things around how students will be here they'll go to school, they'll be on visas, and then once they get their degree, they can't stay. And that seems insane to me. Why aren't we letting those that are educated here stay here? People want to come into work. Why isn't there a more robust policy to allow for that? So, and then I have a couple other great quotes from Elon Musk. Now, sometimes from an environmental perspective, we'll hear that, having kids is a bad thing. It's not good for the earth, the overpopulation conversation. And a lot of it's driven based on food requirements and also energy consumption. So these are just a couple quotes from Elon Musk kind of during the same podcast. The entire United States could be powered by 100 by 100 mile territory of solar production. We could have a civilization that is 100 times more energy intensive than it currently is. So for those of you who are worried about having more immigrants here, increasing our population because of energy constraints, the reality is what's happening with solar and the impact there. We're likely going to cross that threshold, and Elon Musk would argue we're there now, that we can create plenty through solar and not be reliant on coal, natural gas, oil, things like that. And that's not that big of an area, 100 by 100 mile. And he then goes on to say, but who knows if we need the energy capacity, because birth rates worldwide are on the decline. When urbanization, income, and education hit certain levels, birth rates tend to drop, which is what we're seeing in the US. And he would make the argument that this is the biggest single threat to civilization. Now, he's looking at things from kind of a global perspective, but he also made he provided that quote on immigration, is that, because the US is such a desirable place to live, let's continue to recruit the best and allow them to live that American dream. And then his last quote, having kids is not bad for the environment. It's essential to maintaining civilization, right? We have to continue to reproduce. Historically speaking, there's no safer time to bring a child into the world than now. So I really enjoyed just kind of going through and sharing some of my thoughts on there. And again, immigration is a really hot topic and there's a lot more complexity in it. I wanted to cover this from a purely economic perspective, looking at the numbers. And the reality is, looking at the numbers, we are required to continue to grow our working population. And without a growth in our working population, that's going to lead to the decline of the US over time. So I do have a few questions. So let me try to tackle them. All right. So let's try to put these in order here. All right. One question was, does divorce contribute to household growth? I don't know. I wish I could give you an answer on that. I actually don't know how that is calculated. Siri, so someone's doing some fact checking on me. I like it. Siri says that US population has grown 7.5% between 2010 and 2020. So does your chart with immigrants support this increase? I don't know if it supports that 7.5% because that one chart did show based on each state. I don't know if I had checked on there to see if it's had reflected the immigrants as well, right? Because that's a growth of not only native born, but also immigrants. So I don't know. I can probably double check that. It's a fair question. And then the last question that I got was, I'd like to hear that Elon Musk podcast that you keep mentioning. What's the title of it? Where would you find it? So there's a podcast that I've been listening to that I really like. It's called the All In podcast. It's by four, I think they're billionaires, really sharp people. And they just cover all kinds of odd topics. They did a big conference in May, and he was one of their speakers. So you can find it on any podcast station. You can also find it on YouTube if you want to watch the interview instead. But there's a lot of good ones on Elon Musk. If you haven't just looked up videos on Elon Musk on YouTube, he's got a lot of good content to share. So definitely would recommend that. So the All In podcast I listen to weekly. Elon Musk is not on it weekly, but they have lots of good thought-provoking conversations. And I like it because they really run the gamut. They have one gentleman's really conservative, one's more liberal, two are more in the middle. So they have really thoughtful conversations, debate that unfortunately I don't feel like we see in society that much anymore, where people are actually digging into issues and unpacking some of these things, and then also having a healthy debate of disagreement, which I really enjoy that perspective, because I feel like that's how we learn. So, all right, so hopefully some of that made some sense. Let me just make sure I don't have any other questions. I think I got all of them.